Hello, and welcome to an all new episode of the Transfix Take podcast, where each week we deliver news, insights, and trends for shippers and carriers. It's the week of April 10th. I'm Jenny Ruiz, and I'm joined by our market expert, none other than Justin Mays. Mays, I have to ask you, did you see the eclipse yesterday? Did you get a chance at all? What was that like?
Unfortunately, Jenny, I was not able to get outside of the office, even though it was almost 80 degrees here in Atlanta. But no, unfortunately, I wasn't able to. I hope everyone else was able to get a glimpse, though.
I had a feeling it was going to be really crazy and busy for you, but it happened. It's okay. We'll see it again in the next 20 something years, I suppose. So it may be sunny and 70 in some parts of the country, but today there are some areas in the south that are dealing with severe thunderstorms that could potentially turn to tornadoes, bring destructive winds and large hail, especially in the northern parts of Texas and western Tennessee. And I know we talked about some of that might hit you as well in the Atlanta region. So that said, here are the top five worst weather lanes powered by Weather Optics. We've got Dallas appearing on the board multiple times. So Dallas to Memphis with the highest driver risk at 8.2 out of 10. Dallas to Atlanta, San Francisco to Salt Lake City, Dallas to Laredo, and Seattle to Sacramento. Now, there are some of the largest markets by volume here that we've listed. So have you been hearing anything about any changes as we're in the earlier part of the week, and I know this is going to affect it somewhat towards the latter part, but what are you hearing?
Nothing yet, Jenny, but I'm sure through the week we're going to definitely be hearing a lot of drivers who are going to be running late to either the pickup or delivery,
Yeah.
which I think is completely understandable, and shippers would be completely understanding as well. As you mentioned, Dallas to Memphis, Dallas to Atlanta are key lanes that are going to be impacted because that storm is, essentially starting today in the state of Texas and moving eastward through the week. So it is a high impact storm, though I don't think it's going to necessarily bring too many issues to the freight industry other than delays.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think by now we've kind of figured out, or rather, carriers have figured out how to reroute and travel the best way that they possibly can while staying safe. That said, you know what it's time for, the regional breakdown. Now, your bet on where the national average currently sits in week 2 of April seems right on target. So tell us more about what that average looks like and what's going on with tender rejections this week.
Yeah, Jenny, you're exactly right. We're continuing to see softness appear in the market, as we would think when volume generally is lower in the month of April. Tender rejections are still relatively flat, but seeing a slim decline. Not much of a noticeable one, but a slim decline. On the flip side, rates, especially in the spot market, are seeing a pretty significant decline. I mean, just last week we were about $1.65 when we last spoke per mile on line haul. Now we're already at $1.62 rate per mile. Again, it's very regionally driven, but even, we're going to get into it in a little bit, but the southeast, the south is not seeing much pressure right now. And it's really moving in the favor of shippers, but that definitely starts to change at the end of the month, if not certainly in May when we get into more produce season and even DOT week.
Yeah, that's right. We'll talk about that as we get closer. But starting off with the Midwest, this region saw an overall decline of 0.54% over the last 60 days and is close to, or over the last 60 days is close to an overall 11% dip. What can we expect out of the Midwest this week?
We're going to be seeing the same old that we've been talking about for the last month and a half. The Midwest is going to continue to loosen up. It's going to be very lane specific, especially with freight going back to the West Coast, which has been, we've talked about it several times, one of the least desirable destinations. Over the last couple weeks has definitely become more desirable, specifically for freight originating out of the Midwest. We're going to continue to see that play into the favor of shippers because carriers will get higher paying freight out of the West Coast. But we're going to see the same trend going into next week. It has slowed down, and it's going to continue to slow down.
Okay. Well, the Northeast is showing all markets with a decrease. There's no shortage of capacity here. We're looking at a near 10% decrease over the last 60 days. And Maze, I know you've been saying for a few straight weeks in a row now, this may be the same story. So dare I ask, will this change?
It's not. Like you called out, this is the first time in a couple of weeks that we've seen an entire region where every market was on the decline.
Yeah.
And I don't anticipate this to change in the coming weeks. This is one region that specifically is going to continue to see the largest declines week over week.
Okay.
Especially for freight headed down the I-95 corridor to the coastal and southeast region. It's going to continue to be more favorable for carriers to capture that freight as the rates going out of those regions are higher than elsewhere.
Now, the coastal region continues this week's theme of rate decreases with a 1% loss over the last 7 days and a near 6% loss over the last 60 days. Could there be a chance of tightening with what's happening in the South? Wishful
I
thinking?
Yeah, wishful thinking, I'd say. I think this is really just playing to the trend that we see in April.
Yeah.
The coastal region itself still has some room to see a decrease. A lot of that freight stays pretty regionally, if not, seeps up to the northeast or down to the southeast. Overall, though, if the northeast and the southeast are not changing, the coastal region doesn't have a need to change. Freight going into the southeast is still favorable. Same thing with freight going out to the west coast. But over the next 2 or so weeks, we're going to continue to see capacity loosen and drive down their average rate.
Well, speaking of the West Coast, it's really the only region this week that's showing some excitement with gains of 0.24%. Some of the regions with the biggest gains includes Pendleton, Oregon, with a 2% increase. But as it goes, will the West Coast keep its upward momentum going?
The West Coast certainly will,
Yeah.
and we will see it pick up some steam in about a week or so, especially in the back half of the month going into May. That is where we're going to really see the West Coast pick up momentum in favor of carriers. That's going to ultimately drive down the rates of freight going there. But this is well needed for the carriers that originate out of the West Coast, just because they've gone months without pressure on rates to help them out. But this trend is going to continue, and we're going to keep our eye on the West Coast and keep talking about what the potential increases mean to carriers and shippers.
Okay. Now, the Southeast is a region we've been looking at because it's kicked off some seasonality, but even this one is seeing some losses with just a few markets showing tightening, like, Chattanooga, Jackson, and Memphis. What should we expect here given the poor weather conditions that might creep up into the Tennessee region?
So I think we may see some continued tightness in Tennessee. We really haven't seen the state of Tennessee or the Gulf states change too much in terms of capacity and rates. But Florida over the past week has surprisingly, in my opinion, seen a greater decline than I would have anticipated in April. Georgia, especially the Atlanta market, continued to see a downward trend. I don't think we're going to see too much of a change over the next 2 weeks with the Southeast. I think it's going to stay relatively stagnant until the last week of April. And, as we kick into May, we're likely to see this become the hottest region. So it is something to keep an eye on because we don't really know, every year when produce season will start picking up and gain momentum. But at the looks of it right now, we're not going to see any true momentum in carriers' favor until the beginning of May.
Okay, so we've got a few more weeks before we start seeing some real excitement. But as we close out with the South, we mentioned at the top of the show that this area might see some tightening, albeit temporary. But as of the last 7 days, only shows 3 regions with some gains, and these we don't really talk about very often. So there's Lubbock, there's Oklahoma City, and then there's Shreveport. Once the weather clears, do you think we'll continue to see this dip?
I think we're going to continue to see it remain pretty stagnant.
Okay.
It's really going to depend on, Fort Worth, Dallas, and Houston. Those are the volume driving markets.
Yeah.
They're not seen as much as a dip as, the border markets are just yet. But I think, like you called out, the storms are going to have a pretty significant impact on the state of Texas, especially those high volume markets, but also parts of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, which could, bring a stalemate to rates over the next week. After that, I do think we're going to see some more downward pressure before, again, similar to the Southeast, seeing that upward pressure begin in May.
All right, lots to keep an eye out for in the next 2 weeks. But before we go, it's been a while since we've mentioned where we stand with net new carrier revocations. While the market has been showing some slight wins in favor of carriers, which we always love to hear, especially with this 24-month down market for them, we know it's not nearly enough to keep some of these smaller carriers going. So, Maze, what are you seeing in terms of any exit changes from Q1?
Well, we're seeing it pop up in, the media in the industry that over the last month we've seen a slowing of exits in the industry due to, the data behind the change in net authorities being added and being revoked. We did see 2 weeks where we saw the number of authorities being added was greater than being revoked. But it's not a trend yet, so I think we're drawing eyes to it too soon. But at the end of the day, overall, net authority change is slowing down. In Q1, we only lost under 2% of carriers in the industry compared to last year in Q1 where we lost over 6%.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, if we're talking about true capacity, we still have more than 40% higher amount of authorities than we did in 2019 before the pandemic.
Yeah.
So there's still a lot of capacity out there. That's why we continue to see the market be very soft now, well over a year. But we are starting to see some signs, of the seasonality trends kicking in and potentially, boosting rates up. But I think it's taking more time than most people thought it would.
It certainly is, but if we look at what Paul Pojemski has been saying, I think we're sort of right on target with where we may see that big flip in the market. It's just a gradual change. It's not going to be that kind of dramatic flip like I think people are expecting.
Yeah, I think an interesting week will be DOT week,
Yeah.
the road check blitz in May. At the end of the day, carriers over the last few events, whether it was weather or holidays, were able to keep momentum on rates. So it'll be interesting on what happens through DOT week. And we traditionally always see momentum upward on rates. Rejections go up, spot rates go up.
Yeah.
Will carriers be able to hold that, carry that into, produce season and the seasonality changes and, really push that momentum upward that a lot of people are anticipating throughout the year?
Yeah, and July 4th, right? Because that's always a big tipping point to where the summer could look like and eventually what the holidays will look like. But we've got a while till we hit July. With that, we will see you next week with an all new episode of the Transfix Take podcast. As always, drive safely.